let's jump into it. We got a rate cut this week, which seems to be markets like. That seems like from a macro perspective, it should have a good impact on biotech as well. What are your initial thoughts and how are you responding to this 50 basis point rate cut from the Fed?
Yeah, Jonathan, we generally see it as going to be a growing tailwind for the sector. I think as most folks appreciate, biotech is one of the more sensitive subsectors to cost of capital. And, it had been, really punished the last few years with, raising interest rates and expectations for prolonged elevated level of interest rates. So the beginning of a rate cut cycle is a welcome tailwind for the sector.
Yeah, well, it's interesting. If we look at the XBI in particular, the last year has been pretty good to the index in general. It kind of seems like they've gotten used to high rates. Like maybe they've separated the wheat from the chaff, or we've seen a lot of creative destruction, so to speak. It sounds like you anticipate that going forward. Should we be looking at the XBI as a good bellwether for what's happening in biotech? Is there another index or space you like to use to keep a look on things?
Yeah, Jonathan. So historically, XBI had been the equal weight biotech index. It was, the number of stocks changed, but it's about 125, 150 stocks, something like this, right? More recently, in the past quarter, they changed to more of a market cap and volume weighted. So, like many indices, and obviously, if you look at S&P and others, you see crowding at the top, and that theme is driven down. So a lot of folks are talking about looking at like Russell 2000 biotech as sort of an alternative, more equal weight-ish barometer for the sector. But I think that XBI is good for certainly historical comparisons, and I think as we get a longer duration of data with the new market cap weighting, it'll become more apples and oranges.
Yeah. Well, specifically as it relates to this rate cut and tailwinds and all that good stuff, this doesn't seem like a sector where there's a tailwind behind everything. Stock selection is going to be important going forward. Headlines, companies with interesting commercial products, prospects will be at the forefront. One company you've talked a little bit about is Viridian Therapeutics, VRDN. What's your response to that company and some new headlines we've seen there? I guess they've delivered some positive clinical data.
Yeah, I think that's a good example of a company that announced favorable clinical data, as you mentioned, that was rewarded. So they're developing a drug for an orphan disease called thyroid eye disease, and they announced data for their IGF-1R inhibitor recently that compared very favorably to the only approved drug, which is Amgen's Tepezza, which they got from the acquisition of Horizon. And the data that Viridian announced, Jonathan, basically showed inline efficacy, inline safety, but it's administered in 5 intravenous infusions as opposed to 8. A little easier to give. Overall looks pretty competitive. So, the stock traded up material on that. And I think that's just a good example of biotech stock that announced good differentiated data can be rewarded almost regardless of the environment.
Yeah, and it sounds like the P&L projections for that are north of $1 billion. That's pretty good projections too for an investor to think about.
Yeah, Tepezza is going to do 2 billion this year. So, obviously there's some debate about how much market share can they take, and they're also working on a subcutaneous delivery for this drug, which will come, further down the line. But when you have an existing $2 billion product, it's not hard to get to $1 billion.
Yeah. Well, let's go in the other direction. Somebody that I think you've described them as being in the penalty box, Moderna, not performing very well here. What's happening with this company?
Well, we had a little, monkeypox enthusiasm, a couple months back. I think folks remember that, but that quickly turned to, the grim financial reality of their P&L, which is a company that's spending 4-ish billion in R&D alone on top of SG&A and other costs. And, the vaccine revenue just isn't there to support it, right? So it's kind of a 3-ish billion dollar. Those numbers keep coming down on the top line. So, Moderna flipped from, highly profitable for the couple of years during the COVID peak, 18, $19 billion of top line revenue in those years. And now it's, they're burning 4 billion a year, basically. Wow. And, there's some concern actually, Jonathan, that they're not going to have enough cash on their balance sheet to get the cash flow break even, right? So they have about 7 billion of cash, sort of roughly net. If you look at their most recent R&D day, which was a couple of weeks ago, the company updated long-term financial projections and are now saying 2028 for cash flow break even. Well, if you add up the aggregates net cash spend between now and then, it looks like they may run out of cash. So that's why it's in the penalty box.
Yeah, and no matter how much Powell cuts rates, that's not going to help them out. They need more help than rate cuts, don't they?
Yeah, 50 bips is good for a lot of things. It's not going to help, 7 billion to spend in the next few years.
Right. Well, and let's end with one that's kind of interesting. Good news, bad performance. This Neurocrine Biosciences, ticker NBIX, like they've got some good stuff going on. The stock performance hasn't been stellar. What's happening? I don't understand why it's so discounted relative to kind of the cool things they're doing.
Yeah, Jonathan, that's an interesting one because they were working on, so they have an existing commercial business focused on a number of CNS indications, and Grez is their lead drug. It's going to be a multi-billion-dollar franchise, great growth profile. It's got good duration. They have another drug coming online that's going to be complementary to that. So they're building on a highly profitable, growing base business. Now, the reason the stock pulled back in recent weeks pretty sharply was they announced data from a pipeline program which was focused on these new mechanism muscarinic agonists for major depressive disorder, and the data came out was kind of mixed. wasn't a wipeout, okay, but it was compared to a competition which is a little further ahead. Analysts looked at it and kind of said, people were wringing their hands. Now, what's interesting here is that, so the base business for Neurocrine, it's a couple billion doing double-digit CAGR, regardless of what happens with the pipeline. This pipeline class, there were two major M&A acquisitions for competitors in this space. So Karuna was bought by Bristol Myers, Jonathan, about 14 billion, and Cerevel was bought by AbbVie for about 9 billion. For their muscarinic programs. So Neurocrine is doing their own. They actually have 5 separate candidates. The data they released was just for the one of them. But the interesting thing is that Neurocrine, is trading at a $12 billion market cap. The base business alone is worth more than that. So it's almost like, if they put out data that looked as good or better than those two that were acquired, probably be a $25 billion stock. It might actually have a bigger market cap than Moderna. Kind of funny. Right? But because the data came in a little below expectations, people, I think folks were optimistic, right? And so, I think you got a little bit of overcorrection to the downside. So this is an interesting one. Maybe there's some tax loss selling, but I think as you look forward, it's prime for re-rating, particularly in an environment where you have lower interest rates. And maybe just one more point on the 50 bips, Jonathan. I think that, we got a 50 basis point cut. I think expectations are now 200 basis points, additional cuts between now and kind of middle of next year. That's not because there's this robust, amazing economy, right? There's some concerns, and some voices are louder than others and how concerning it is. But maybe just the final thought for folks to consider is that pharma companies that have innovative medicines, branded medicines, is inelastic demand. So if you do see a softening in the broader economic environment, you kind of get a double tailwind. You have, the benefit from lower interest rates, making some of these small cap assets more attractive. And then you also have, kind of better positioning relative to inelastic demand.
Yeah, that's a great point. And while we haven't heard a lot on the campaign trail, so to speak, about healthcare and healthcare spending, it's not going down, right? We might not have heard any big policy proposals, but nobody's saying we're spending less on reimbursements or anything like that. So that kind of adds to the inelastic comment you just made.
Oh, and maybe just one point on that, right? I don't want to get too deep in the weeds in the presidential debate that was done recently, but guess what wasn't mentioned at all? Drug pricing. I didn't hear it once.
No, that's right.
Did you hear? And all the conversation around health policy was very nebulous. There was nothing specific. It really wasn't center stage. It was a couple of very oblique comments, and it's not a major part of either candidate's platform at this moment.
Yeah, well, sounds like a really great time for us. I mean, things can change on a dime, but biotech is certainly worth keeping your eye on. And as always, really good insights. Appreciate your update on these 3 stocks and things in general. We'll talk to you next month. We'll see what happens the month before the election. Oh boy, it could get exciting or terrifying. One or the other, probably.
Never a dull moment. And look, John, we think any pullback from here could be a buying opportunity. We think, we like, I think as you've heard, we like the setup for biotech here. And, I think if we're selective and we pick well, I think we'll like the results.
Sounds great. Well, thanks, Mark. Enjoy that beach day. Go Big Red, go Huskers, and we'll talk to you soon. Appreciate your time as always.
Thanks. Have a good one.
Goodbye.